All right, so are you ready to dive deep into Ukraine again?
Always ready for more Ukraine.
Well, today's a little different. I think you'll find it interesting. We've got this audio from a Russian commentator, someone who seems to be pretty plugged in to how the Kremlin's thinking.
Ooh, that's always fascinating.
Yeah.
It's so hard to get reliable intel.
Yeah, and this guy doesn't hold back. He comes right out and says Trump getting back in the White House means he thinks there'll be a push for peace, like right away, within days of the inauguration.
Wow. Bold prediction. Got to give him that.
Right. So to figure out why he thinks that, we got to look at who he's talking about. He brings up this Samuel Charap guy, used to advise Gazprom. Now he's a big shot analyst at RAND.
Oh yeah, Charap. I've heard of him. He's got quite the reputation as a Ukraine skeptic. That's what they're calling him, at least.
Ukraine skeptic. Okay, so what does that even mean? Like in plain English.
Basically, he's saying the U.S. needs to be careful how much we back Ukraine, especially with all the military aid. And get this. The commentator actually thinks Charap's views swayed the Biden administration. Like, their whole approach to arming Ukraine has been way more cautious than a lot of people wanted.
So you're saying this one guy had that much pull with the Democrats. Imagine what he could do with Trump in charge.
Right. It makes you wonder about all those campaign promises to end the war quickly. Maybe there's more to it than just talk.
So what's the plan? What does this Charap guy actually want to see happen? The commentator calls it a Korean scenario.
Oh, the Korean scenario. Okay, so think of it like this. A ceasefire agreement that pretty much freezes the conflict, right where the lines are now. Maybe a few tweaks here and there. But the main thing is to stop the fighting and make that the new border for all intents and purposes.
You know, that sounds an awful lot like what they were talking about during those Istanbul talks back in 2022.
You remember those?
Yeah, of course. And they fell apart. The commentator's pretty bitter about that. He claims Kyiv was offered a pretty sweet deal back then.
He specifically calls out Poroshenko. Says he's totally flip-flopped.
Poroshenko, the former president.
Yeah, him. Apparently, back in 2022, he was open to a deal along those lines. But now, forget about it. That's what this guy's saying anyway. It just shows you how much the political landscape has shifted. Like, negotiations are a whole different ballgame now. Way trickier.
Yeah, that's true. Has the window closed for that kind of deal? I mean, the longer this drags on, the higher the stakes get.
It's a good question. It is a concern. But, you know, even if we set Trump and his quick fix aside for a minute, there's a bigger question here. Would stopping the fighting actually solve anything?
It's like the commentator himself keeps saying, just putting a halt to the violence doesn't magically erase all the tension and anger. That started this whole mess.
Right. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg. You got to address the underlying issues.
He says that's what's wrong with Biden's approach. All this open-ended support for Ukraine, but no clear end goal. Like, what happens after the guns fall silent? Then what?
And how do you actually deal with the root causes of the conflict? It's the point a lot of people seem to be missing.
Does he have any answers, though? Or is he just all doom and gloom?
No, he does offer some paths forward. He says Charap laid out 4 key things any successful peace plan has to have.
All right, I'm listening. Hit me with these 4 points.
Well, first off, you got to have a rock-solid ceasefire agreement. No brainer, right?
Right.
Then there's got to be some way to guarantee Ukraine's security, you know, after the war ends. And then you need a mechanism to hold Russia accountable for what they've done.
Okay, that's 3. What's the last one?
The last one is you got to have a plan to stabilize relations between Russia and the West.
On paper, it sounds pretty straightforward.
Yeah, well, the devil's in the details, isn't he? How do you actually make all that happen in a way everyone will accept? Especially when there's so much bad blood on both sides.
Millions of dollars if you can figure that one out.
Right.
Let's dive into these points one by one. Starting with the security guarantees for Ukraine, this is where it gets really interesting. The commentator says that joining NATO, that's a no-go for Russia.
Oh, yeah, that's been their red line from the beginning. Not going to change anytime soon.
But get this. He suggests that joining the EU could be a real alternative.
Wait, hold on. How does that even work? Ukraine and the EU?
He even quotes Article 42.7 of the EU treaty. And I'm paraphrasing here, but it basically says all member states are obligated to help each other out if one of them gets attacked. His point is this could be a stronger security guarantee than even NATO's Article 5.
I see where he's going with that.
Yeah.
But wouldn't every single EU member have to agree to let Ukraine in? That seems like a long shot.
And just imagine the economic and political chaos that would cause for both sides. It's not exactly a match made in heaven.
No, it's not. But here's the kicker. This commentator thinks the whole EU membership thing might actually be in Russia's interest.
Well, wait, are you saying he thinks Russia's pushing for this on purpose? Why would they do that?
He's saying Russia sees Ukraine joining the EU as a way to stir up trouble within the bloc, like a way to weaken it from the inside. It's a cynical view for sure, but you can't deny that Russia and the EU have been at odds for a while.
So he's saying Russia's playing the long game here, using Ukraine as a pawn to weaken the West.
That's his take.
Yeah.
And it raises some serious red flags about what could happen. If a peace deal includes Ukraine joining the EU, it's like a Trojan horse.
Whoa, this is getting complicated. So this Russian commentator thinks bringing Ukraine into the EU would actually help Russia in the long run.
That seems to be what he's implying.
Wow. And he ties this into Trump's whole anti-NATO thing. Remember how he always badmouthed NATO?
Oh, yeah.
The commentator thinks Russia could use that to its advantage.
He specifically points to the Baltic states and how much they rely on the U.S. for protection through NATO. If Trump pulls back from the alliance, it could give Russia the opportunity to make a move there.
That's a pretty scary thought.
It is. So we've got this picture. He's painting Russia, encouraging Ukraine to join the EU, knowing it'll cause chaos and weaken the West. And then Trump's skepticism about NATO opens the door for Russia to flex its muscles in Eastern Europe.
It's a bold strategy, that's for sure.
It's definitely Machiavellian. But we can't just ignore it, right? Agree or disagree. This guy's giving us a glimpse into how the Kremlin might be thinking about this whole situation and how they see a path to peace.
Yeah, it's definitely given us a lot to think about. And it makes you wonder what other out there ideas this commentator has up his sleeve.
Well, he does have a pretty unique idea about how to punish Russia for the invasion.
I'm almost afraid to ask. But go on, tell me.
He thinks the West should confiscate all those Russian assets that have been frozen in Western banks. Like $300 billion worth.
Whoa, hold on. Are we talking about just taking their money? That seems a little extreme.
He's saying this money could be used to rebuild Ukraine.
Like reparations.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But wouldn't that cause a whole legal mess, and wouldn't it just escalate things even more?
Probably, yeah.
He argues that the Kremlin should be willing to swallow that bitter pill, in exchange for peace and a lifting of sanctions. He actually says any peace deal needs to address Russia's concerns too.
So there's some give and take in there, I guess. But would Ukraine be okay with this? That money belongs to Russia. It's not the West's to give away. Plus, it's not like Russia would be held fully accountable for the invasion.
It's a fair point.
Yeah.
And that brings us to another controversial part of his analysis. He seems to think that Zelensky needs to be sidelined if there's any hope of a settlement.
Wait, is he saying Ukraine shouldn't even be at the negotiating table?
He doesn't say that directly. But he argues that the U.S. and Russia need to talk directly, maybe even leave Ukraine out of it, at least at first. He thinks that's the only way to make real progress.
So basically the opposite of Biden's whole nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine thing.
Right. He thinks Zelensky's the problem.
Wow.
He even suggests that the U.S. could use its influence to replace Zelensky with someone more willing to play ball.
Okay, hold on now. That's a whole other can of worms. We're talking about meddling in another country's elections.
It's definitely controversial. And ethically questionable.
Not to mention, it's pretty hypocritical for the West to be preaching democracy while simultaneously thinking about pulling a stunt like that.
It's a dangerous game to play. And there's no guarantee it would even work. Who's to say the new leader would be any better?
It could backfire and make things even worse.
Yeah, it could.
Before we go too far down that rabbit hole, let's come back to this comparison the commentator makes to the Korean War.
Yes, Korea.
I vaguely remember learning about it in school. Didn't it take them forever to reach an agreement? Like decades of back and forth.
You're thinking of the Korean Armistice. Back in 1953, it was a long process. He says there were over 500 meetings over 2 years before they finally agreed on something.
500 meetings. That's insane. And he's using that to contrast with the situation in Ukraine now, where there's barely any communication between the two sides at all.
It really puts into perspective how much work needs to be done to even get to the point where negotiations are possible.
And if this commentator is right about Trump wanting a quick resolution, well, it makes you wonder if rushing into a deal would really solve anything.
That's a valid concern. He worries that Trump might be so impatient to get a deal that they end up with something superficial, something that doesn't really address the root of the problem. And that just sets the stage for another conflict down the road.
Like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. Yeah.
Exactly. And that brings us to his last point. The most unsettling one, I think.
Okay, I have a bad feeling about this. What is it?
He warns that Zelensky might actually do something provocative, militarily. I mean, to try and derail the peace talks.
Whoa, wait. Is he saying Zelensky might deliberately escalate the conflict just to sabotage negotiations?
He thinks Zelensky's worried about losing power
Hmm.
and that he might feel threatened by a peace deal that doesn't align with his vision for Ukraine. So he might resort to desperate measures.
But what kind of action are we talking about?
He suggests maybe an attack on Crimea or something else that would dramatically raise the stakes.
That's a dangerous game to play. It could blow up in his face.
Absolutely. It really highlights how fragile things are
Yeah.
and how easily miscalculations can happen.
So we've got Zelensky playing with fire and this Russian commentator outlining all these wild scenarios. It's a lot to process.
It is.
I think we need a minute to digest all of this. We've just been hit with a ton of information, and a lot of it is pretty far out there.
It's definitely outside the mainstream narrative and honestly a bit unsettling.
Yeah.
But even if we don't agree with everything this guy says, it's important to try and understand where he's coming from. You know, what it might tell us about how the Kremlin is thinking. So taking all that in, what stands out to you most about his take?
I gotta say, it's the cynicism.
Yeah.
You know, this guy seems to think everybody involved is just out for themselves. Like nobody actually wants a real lasting peace. It's kind of depressing.
Yeah, it's pretty bleak. But you got to admit, the way things are going, with the fighting getting worse and worse and nobody trusting anybody, it's not that surprising some people would see it that way.
I guess so. It just makes me feel like Ukraine, the country that's actually suffering, is just a pawn in this big power struggle.
Yeah, it's something this analysis really highlights. Even if we don't buy into everything he's saying, he's basically saying Ukraine's fate isn't being decided on its own terms, but by this clash between Russia and the West.
And that's dangerous, right? I mean, can there really be a peace that's good for Ukraine? Or will they just get forced into a deal that mostly benefits these bigger countries?
That's the million-dollar question. And there's no easy answer. As cynical as this guy is, he does remind us that any peace deal is going to involve compromise, hard choices, maybe even betrayals.
It's heavy stuff. It makes you wonder if this whole rush for a quick peace under Trump, assuming that's even what he wants, might just backfire.
I get that. While a quick resolution is always good, rushing into a deal without addressing the real problems could just create more problems down the road. You said it yourself. It's like slapping a Band-Aid on a gaping wound.
Exactly. And let's not forget what he said about Zelensky, that the U.S. could try to get him removed. I mean, that's messed up.
Yeah, that's a line you don't cross. It sets a terrible precedent. Like, we can just get rid of democratically elected leaders if they don't play ball with us.
So much for the West promoting democracy, right?
It just doesn't add up. And even if we could remove Zelensky, who's to say the next guy would be any better?
Or would it just make things even more unstable?
It's a slippery slope. Once you start down that road,
Yeah.
who knows where it ends?
So let's say this guy is right, and he knows what the Kremlin's thinking. And let's say a peace deal is coming soon. What does that actually mean for Ukrainians? I think we have to be prepared for Ukraine having to give up a lot,
Yeah.
things that the Ukrainian people who fought so hard might not be happy with.
There's a real chance of a backlash, both inside Ukraine and from the countries that have supported them.
And what if Russia sees those concessions as a sign of weakness? Doesn't that just make them more likely to attack again later?
It's a real worry. That's why any peace agreement has to have strong security guarantees for Ukraine. Not just empty promises, but real concrete measures that will keep Russia from attacking again.
Guarantees with teeth, so to speak.
Exactly. And the international community, the West especially, needs to step up and make sure that happens. It can't just be talk. It has to be backed up by action.
Because if Ukraine is left on its own, any peace deal is meaningless.
It's true. And we're not just talking about military support either. Ukraine's going to need massive economic and humanitarian assistance to rebuild and recover. It's a long-term commitment.
Yeah, it's not going to be quick or easy. It's a huge challenge that's going to take a lot of effort and resources from the whole world.
You're right. It is. And it's a commitment we have to make if we're serious about all this talk of sovereignty and self-determination and building a just and lasting peace.
That's well said. This commentator's analysis might be cynical and disturbing, but it does force us to face reality.
Yeah, he shows us what's really at stake.
It's a wake-up call,
It is.
making us think hard about what peace actually means and how hard it's going to be to get there.
We can't be naive or pretend this is going to be easy. The road to peace in Ukraine is going to be long and full of obstacles.
But we can't give up.
No, we can't.
This is where I get stuck, though. This commentator says peace talks are the only way out. But then he also says nobody's really acting in good faith, and any deal will probably be bad and won't last. It's all pretty doom and gloom.
It's definitely not optimistic.
Huh.
But even in all that negativity, there are some hopeful signs.
Oh, like what?
Well, he admits that Russia has some legitimate security concerns, things that need to be addressed in any peace deal. It's not just about forcing Russia to surrender completely.
So there's room for compromise.
Yeah. And he also points out that there might be more going on behind the scenes than we realize. Like, remember Lavrov saying that France wanted direct talks with Russia?
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
That suggests there might be more willingness to talk than we see publicly.
But how does that work with Biden saying Ukraine has to be involved in all the talks? It seems like they have different ideas about how to move forward.
It's a tricky situation. We have to respect Ukraine's right to have a say in its own future. But sometimes those back-channel talks, even if they're controversial, can be the best way to break a deadlock.
It's a tough balance to strike.
It is. And while we're on the subject of tricky things, what about this Korean scenario he keeps bringing up? How realistic is that as a model for Ukraine?
It's tempting to compare them, right? Since the Korean War never really ended, it's just been frozen for decades. But things are way more complicated in Ukraine.
For one thing, the whole geopolitical situation is totally different. Korea was a Cold War thing, with the US and Soviet Union backing different sides. Ukraine is way more messy.
And the history and culture are different too. Korea was already divided before the war. Ukraine has its own unique identity and wants to stay whole.
So while the Korean model might give us some ideas, we can't just copy and paste it onto Ukraine.
Right. And there's something else to think about. Something this commentator doesn't really address. The human cost of a frozen conflict.
You're talking about how people would still suffer, even if the fighting stopped.
Yeah. Imagine millions of Ukrainians still displaced from their homes and jobs, with the threat of war always hanging over them. Is that really peace?
It's a dark thought. And it makes you question what peace really means. Is it just the absence of fighting? Or is it something more? Something that lets people rebuild their lives and have hope for the future?
Those are big questions. Questions we have to wrestle with.
We do.
And it brings us back to the main challenge. How do we get past all this cynicism and mistrust that this commentator is talking about and actually build a lasting peace in Ukraine?
That's the question, isn't it? And it's one we'll keep exploring in our next segment.
Okay, so we've been deep in the weeds with this Russian commentator and his pretty dark view of peace in Ukraine. He thinks a deal's coming, but it'll be messy. Ukraine will have to give up a lot, and it's all just a power play between Russia and the West.
Yeah, it's a grim picture.
Mm-hmm.
But remember, even if he's right about the Kremlin thinking this way, things can still change. There are other players involved with their own goals, and the situation is constantly shifting.
That's true, but for argument's sake, let's say he's right about Trump wanting a quick deal. Does Trump actually have the power to make that happen? Can he really get Russia to agree to a lasting peace?
That's the key question. What can Trump offer Putin that would be worth making real concessions?
And what about the Europeans? They've been backing Ukraine all along, but this war's got to be hurting them too.
Absolutely. Their economies are taking a hit, and even though people still support helping Ukraine, that could change, especially if things get tough at home.
So wouldn't they be open to a deal even if it's not perfect? They're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place?
Right.
Definitely.
They want peace, but they also don't want to look weak or like they're abandoning Ukraine. They don't want to reward Russia or encourage more conflicts.
And then there's Zelensky. This commentator thinks he's a problem, that he might even try to sabotage the talks just to stay in power.
It's a cynical view, but Zelensky's a smart guy. He's become a symbol of defiance. He's not going to accept the deal that makes Ukraine look defeated.
So he could mess everything up, even if Russia, the US, and Europe all agree.
Yeah, he could. And that makes things even riskier for those who want peace. If they can't get Zelensky on board, or if he does something drastic to stop the talks, it could be a disaster.
Things could escalate even further.
Right. Everyone digs in their heels, trust breaks down, and ultimately the Ukrainian people suffer even more.
Exactly. It's a dangerous game with very little room for error. So how do we get past all this and actually find a peace that works? And that's fair.
It feels impossible.
Yeah.
Everyone says they want peace, but there are so many obstacles, so much mistrust. It's hard to be optimistic.
I know. But even in the worst situations, we got to hold on to hope. We have to look for any chance of dialogue, any way to understand each other. Maybe this commentator's analysis, as cynical as it is, can actually help us.
Help us? How? Cynicism doesn't seem very helpful.
It makes us face hard truths.
Oh.
It makes us question our assumptions and think about what everyone's really after in this conflict. It reminds us there are no easy answers.
So it's not about finding the perfect solution. It's about finding something that works, even if it's not ideal, something that causes the least amount of harm and gives people a chance to heal and rebuild. I think that's a good way to put it. We have to acknowledge the complexities. and the different agendas, and work patiently to find common ground to build trust, to create a foundation for peace, even if it's fragile at first.
It sounds like a long and difficult road, one that requires being open-minded and willing to compromise, and realizing that peace isn't just an endpoint, it's a process.
Well said. It also requires a change in how we see things. We have to remember that we're all human beings beyond our differences, our political beliefs, our nationalities. We're all connected. Our fates are tied together, and peace isn't just a nice idea. It's essential for us to survive.
That's a powerful thought. It reminds me that even with all this chaos, there's always hope, as long as we keep working for it, keep striving for a better future, where conflicts like this are a thing of the past.
Exactly. And that brings us to you, our listener. Does this Russian commentator's take change how you see the possibility of peace in Ukraine? What do you think about the risks and benefits of the different approaches we've talked about?
And if he's right about what the Kremlin's thinking, what does that mean for the future of this war and for the world? These are questions worth thinking about, questions that will shape what happens next. So keep digging, keep asking questions, keep looking for those signs of hope. And until next time, stay curious.